ways that it can present, because knowing exactly what to look for will help you avoid missing it or mistaking it for something else. You'll get key insights in how to work with the nervous system to address collapse submit. Not only that, I'll also share a few strategies that can help you stay grounded and effective when you're working with a client who has collapsed and shut down. And finally, we'll look at the defensive adaptation of P's and P's. We'll get into how it develops in the context of chronic trauma. And here's the thing, it can sometimes lead treatment astray. So we'll take you through the specific precautions that can help you work more skillfully with P's and P's. We want you to leave this session with the latest thinking on all three of these defenses, as well as with reliable strategies for working with each one. So let's get started. According to Dr. Janina Fisher, the response of attached cry for help is probably the least understood survival response. And yet,
that's the earliest survival defense that a baby has, is that ability to cry. But we see it in other animals that make sounds when they're hurt, that alert other members of their group to come and help them. So it's a very, very necessary survival defense. Often in abusive families, it's not a safe animal defense. Just like food is not safe in the context of abusive families generally, the cry for help response can be dangerous if it triggers the perpetrator. So often that cry for help response, the client might say, I don't know why. Why didn't anybody notice that we were bruised? Why didn't anybody notice that we were growing hungry? And you can hear that cry for help part in the way they say it, in the voice. Why didn't anybody do something? Right? That's the voice of the cry for help or attachment cry part.
now one key thing to note about attached cry for help right off the bat, it's not so much a cry for support and comfort, but rather it comes from a more desperate and helpless place. It's a cry for survival.
The cry for help really has to do with that very primitive defensive response. And there's a feeling of desperation and panic. Like trauma always has to do with survival. So for a client or a person who's experiencing that cry for help, there's a feeling of, I'm not going to survive unless you take care of me. You've got to help me. Okay. Which is different from feeling distressed and upset and needing your friend or your lover or your parent or your sibling or whatever to talk to and hold you and be there with you. Not for rescue, but for the shared experience and for comfort and a feeling of soothing. It doesn't have a life or death quality.
But here's the thing, this particular defense response can often produce a reaction in others that is actually the opposite of what your patient is seeking. So to get a sense of why this happens, it can be helpful to consider attached cry for help from a polyvagal perspective.
Primarily, it's going to be a sympathetic mobilization. It's an attempt to use mobilization as a co-regulatory activity. So the therapist is actually going to find this uncomfortable because the cues of presence will be there, but the behaviors are functionally intrusive, moving into the space of the therapy. So you have to understand the intentionality, which is reaching out to you as a valiant attempt to co-regulate. So you need to have a degree of, in this case, you need a sense of both compassion for your client, but of course self-compassion for your own reaction to those types of cues that your client's throwing at you.
So, yes, this particular defense response often makes practitioners feel uncomfortable because it can feel intrusive and even threatening. But that's just one way that attached cry for help can be tricky to work with. Because you see, our natural helping instincts can sometimes complicate treatment for patients who are caught in this particular defensive response. We may not feel the urge to pull away from the intensity of this response, but instead, we might feel the urge to rescue our patient. We'll talk more about the urge to rescue in a minute, but first, let's look at the specific behavior patterns that can help you recognize attached cry.
So, very typically, in my clients, I see the attached cry or cry for help response manifesting in multiple voice notes. Uh, Nowadays, with texts, right, they complain that it's too long between sessions. They have a hard time leaving the office at 5:30. Or there's a way in which the client becomes very, very childlike and sort of sweet and helpless and childlike that I associate with that cry for help or attached cry. I don't want to forget this idealization of the therapist.
Now, a little later in this session, we'll get into how idealization of the therapist in particular can present unique challenges in working with a patient's cry for help. To get back to what I hinted about it a few moments ago, how might your natural inclination to help your patient sometimes complicate treatment of this particular defense response?
It can be uh, tricky to work with as a therapist because you want to be there for your client, but with a cry for help response, we also need to strengthen their ability to be there for themselves. So I think that's tricky. I think often clients need to be really dependent on you for a period, but not it can't go on because they have to find it in themselves.
Finding that balance between being there for your patient and empowering them to be there for themselves can be delicate work under any circumstance, but perhaps even more so when you're working with a patient in the throes of an attached cry for help response. And here's what can complicate matters even a little bit more. According to Janina, the enactment of attached cry for help can often be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder.
And as soon as that diagnosis is given, that behavior is pathologized rather than understood.
Janina's caution here really helps us see why it's so important for practitioners to build their skill at not only recognizing attached cry for help, but also being able to distinguish its behavioral patterns from those of borderline personality disorder. While both share idealizing the therapist encounter, a patient in attached cry response will usually be more desperate and childlike. And remember, there is a sympathetic nervous system activation driving this survival behavior. Now, we've looked at several specific behavior patterns that can help you recognize attached cry for help. We've also demonstrated how your natural helping instincts can often backfire on patients who are caught in this particular defensive adaptation. So next, let's get into several key strategies for working with attached cry for help. To start, I want you to see how Janina addresses her patient's cry for help while being careful to not spark that desperate inner longing. In part, it has to do with managing those specific behavior patterns that we talked about just a few minutes ago.
So I have to be very rural, and I also have to be very careful not to answer too many texts voicemails and emails to hold the time factor at the end of sessions. And I'm so sorry that we're out of time today. Right? It's such a shame. We could go talking. Uh, um, but we have to stop. So that I'm meeting that that cry for help. Um, that I'm not stimulating a more frantic, desperate mode. The therapist has to hold boundaries without becoming rigid or confrontational. And I do that by engaging my boundary muscles. We have a set of boundary muscles across the midline and down the sides. So I try to bring warmth to my facial expression and tone of voice, but I keep my boundary muscles engaged so that I am saying that I'm here, I'm enjoying the company, I'm with you. It's interesting because even when I demonstrate this in front of an audience, most people in audiences say, I could feel it when you're engaged in that process. So it's a very work communication.
Now, if you've joined us for the first two sessions of this program, you might be noticing how this concept of right brain to right brain communication keeps coming up. Right brain communication is about going beyond words alone to communicate with your patient. It's about using nonverbal cues like facial expression, eye contact, and tone of voice to resonate with your patient on a more somatic and emotional level. And because trauma can impact your patient's ability to process much in words alone, knowing how to communicate right brain to right brain can be a crucial catalyst for healing. With that in mind, here's a specific case from Dr. Paddock. I want you to see how you might use this content to work with your patients.
I'm thinking of one client, I'll call her Meg. Um, she was put in boarding school when she was 8 years old. And she had to go back year after year, and she was terribly bullied. And she was just remembered, she was just sobbing and sobbing in the car, saying to her dad, "Don't let me go, don't let me go." And he was like, "You'll be fine. School's fine, you'll be fine." And gave no credence to her terror. Really. So in therapy, I had to resonate with the uh, intensity of her desperation and really demonstrate that I got it. This was horrible. This was horrific for her. But we had to work then with that child part and how we could soothe her. So she felt the child part in her body and her core, and she felt like she was never going to be safe again. So we did work with the relationship and eye contact. Can that part of you feel safe with me? What happens when you look into my eyes, etc., to shift that belief. So we used the relationship, but then we had to come to her ability to connect with that desperate part through her touch, through her compassion for that part, and through her own ability to soothe herself. She was able to really get it in her body that she was no longer in danger, that the bullying was over. See, with trauma like that, it's as if it's still occurring in the present. That's what Anno Vanderhart says, clients live in trauma time. It's as if it's still happening. That part of her had never caught up to present time. So as she kind of updated the files through first my empathy and comfort, and then her own ability to soothe that part, and she also realized, she said that my friends always complain to me that I'm too needy. And she realized it came from that. So what shifted for her was the ability to have healthy relationships and not come from this desperate need for rescuing.
So, two key ideas you might hone in on here from Pat's story. First, though Pat started by helping her patient feel safe with her, Notice how she then moved her client toward the capacity to self-regulate. That's where they ultimately need to go. And second, notice again how a person's attached cry for help reflex can produce the opposite response that they long for. I'm thinking of Pat's mention of her client's neediness and how her client's friends often complained about that. So let's look at a case study that might help your work with that particular aspect of the attached cry for help response. But before we do, real quick, if you haven't already registered for the gold package, let me ask you now to sign up. Putting together this program took the time and talents of everyone on the NICA BMC. So if you can, please purchase a gold package. You see, your registration will support us so that we can continue to develop projects like this and so that we can continue to make them available for free to practitioners around the world. You can click the link below anytime during or after this session to purchase the gold package. Now let's get to that case study. I want you to see how Dr. Pat Ogden worked with a couple to address how one partner's cry for help was perpetually alienating the other partner.
It was a lesbian couple, actually, who came to therapy, and we'll call one of them Jen. Jen had this cry for help, and her partner, Blanca, said she's always so needy. She's always wanting contact with me. And Jen was like, leaning forward and had that towards Blanca with this desperate need for connection, which just pushed Blanca away. So that was one point in the session when we were studying what happened when Jen would lean forward like that, and Blanca had the opposite reaction to what Jen wanted. She wanted to get out of there. And I mean, there's so many different ways of working. In this section, Blanca told Jen how she could reach out to her and have her respond, so that she wanted to respond. We practiced literally reaching with the arms. She leaned back, kept her gaze soft, and reached out, and then Jen immediately took her hand, wanted to move forward. So with them, it was an exercise so that Jen could change her pattern to get what she wanted back from Blanca.
So what about when your patient's cry for help behaviors stir up discomfort or dysregulation in you as the practitioner? According to Dana, your nervous system can often feel assaulted by the patient's highly charged sympathetic nervous system and the attached cry for help energy. That's why Deb finds a polyvagal approach to helping work with attached cry for help so important.
For me, interrupting the automaticity, that sympathetic loop, is important. And I do that not by saying stop or by distracting, but by saying I see it, I feel it, and I'm meeting it with my ventral vagal energy. Can you feel that? Can you sense that? Can we stop for a moment and check? So again, incumbent on us to anchor in ventral. This sort of is the theme of being, not only a polyvagal and functional therapist where I identify as anchored in ventral, but as a therapist to stay in that regulated state so that we can offer that regulated energy to our clients, even the ones that are so demanding, sympathetically demanding.
I just want to make sure it's clear what Deb's talking about when she refers to ventral vagal energy. Ventral vagal energy is about boosting your patient's feelings of safety and activating their ability to socially engage. You might think of it as the good stuff of human relating that includes playfulness, cooperation, and co-regulation. That sense of being okay to be in contact with each other. It's important for practitioners to regulate their own nervous system to stay grounded or anchored in ventral, as Deb put it, especially while they're working with attached cry for help. Now, that can sometimes be a tall order in the face of this response. So, what if you do start to notice yourself getting overwhelmed? What do you do then?
And the thing to do when that happens is say, oh, I just noticed that I had this response to feeling like, it was too big a demand for me to meet you in this way. So let me regulate. Let's try that again.
See, when you miss or try to ignore what's going on in the nervous system, whether it's your own or your patient's, the nervous system is likely to become more, not less, dysregulated.
And that other nervous system is going to increase its survival response because once we miss a tune, we go into the category of dangerous. We're no longer a companion or someone who's collaborating. We're now an enemy, a foe in the danger category.
Now, the ultimate goal is for patients to both co-regulate and self-regulate. The process involves experimenting with a few ways to bring the patient into those feelings of safety and that ability to socially engage. And all the while, you're assuring your patient that you're not going to abandon them and you're not going to tell them that they must learn to self-regulate. That's because they'll also need to co-regulate. You're looking to eventually have them do both at the same time. And as you go along, you're assessing whether or not you're meeting the needs of your patient's nervous system.
The client's nervous system is saying, this is what I need, and nobody's ever been able to give it to me. And it feels overwhelming. It feels like a well you'll never fill. And yet that I have found if you keep showing up and pick one or two ways, keep showing up, that well begins to get filled. It's great.
Now that we've walked you through several strategies for how to work with attached cry for help, let's look at two common reactions that practitioners have when they're faced with this trauma response.
One is it can be very off-putting. We feel disgusted, we feel frustrated, we feel put upon, we feel exhausted. And so the tendency is to push back and say no and get angry. The other, actually more common one, is to have the compassionate caretaking response like, oh, let me help you. You're having such a hard time. Um, Let me deal with these child parts. They just need more time and attention. Both of those reactions are problematic because neither of them are geared toward helping the client actually develop secure attachment. Right? It seems like the caretaking is, but actually, attachment cry has nothing to do with secure attachment. It's an incredibly defensive, desperate kind of measure in which the client is really fixed in focus on gaining the care and attention of the therapist. They are not interested in and cannot focus in that moment on what's going on with me. What do I need to do to work with my own process here? Which, of course, is the position of being in therapy.
So when it comes to attached cry for help, our very reaction to it can present a challenge to working with it. Not only that, but as we've talked about earlier in the session, attached cry for help can often lead to patients idealizing the therapist. Now, when that happens, it can be problematic in many ways. But there's one way in particular that I want to zero in on.
The attached cry part idealizes the therapist and is very hurt when if we say, as we were trained to say, I'm going to disappoint you. That's devastating for that attached cry part, right? It might be something for the therapist to remember that idealization is going to be punctuated with times that we trigger the client. But when we trigger the client, we often trigger the fight part, the angry part. Sometimes the attached part. The attached part is also the part of the client who feels empathically failed. Right, sir? The way you told me about your vacation, you're going to be gone so long. And why did you tell me at the beginning of the therapy hour? The anger is again the fight part because fight is the animal defense um, of anger, aggression, hypervigilance.
Now, with a structurally dissociated patient, what we talked about last week in Module 2, you could see how easy it might be to diagnose borderline personality disorder. While the attach cry part might idealize the therapist, a fight part might attack the therapist. So, when it comes to working with a patient's attach cry for help response, I don't think we can overemphasize the importance of trying to strike that fine balance. That balance between setting firm boundaries, but doing it in as warmly a way as possible. This really matters because that way you're doing what you can to avoid triggering the desperate, sometimes frantic neediness that is such a big part of attach cry for help. Not only that, you're also reducing the risk of riling up the fight. So now we've walked you through the attach cry for help response. First, we looked at why this response can produce the opposite reactions of what your patient is seeking. Second, we covered the specific behavior patterns that can indicate attach cry for help. And then third, we went over strategies for working with this response. Now let's move on to the collapse submit response. Now you might hear some of the experts in this session use the term collapse submit interchangeably with collapse shutdown. I apologize for that, but both terms refer to how hypo-aroused the patient is. So to begin, let's be clear about what is collapse submit and what does it look like?
If we're thinking of collapse in terms of trauma, I would say that that is associated with the pain death response powered by the dorsal vagal system that starts to shut things down. And it often shows in a collapsed posture, a flaccidity in the musculature. Like when an animal plays possum, this flaccidity in the muscles is just limp.
Now, at the top of this session, I mentioned that collapse submit is the response that you might think of as the body's defense strategy of last resort. So, what did I mean by that? Well, collapse submit is the last in the series of what experts often think of as the instinctive defensive responses.
Of course, the most adaptive response, if we can, is to flee. And if we can't flee, then we fight. And if fighting isn't successful, then we have this tonic immobility freeze, this death feigning, right, in hopes that the predator will lose interest. But if the predator doesn't lose interest, which would be the case in chronic traumatization or torture, then we have to go to collapse, that really passive defensive response where we shut down, where we collapse, and where we submit.
Now, here's the thing. Think about how adaptive this collapse submit response is at the time of trauma. After all, when your patient is in collapse submit, they're shut down, they're numb, and they're feeling none of the pain or terror of the trauma as it's happening.
And this is associated with a lot of neurobiological alterations and neurochemical alterations. For example, we get a massive release of endorphins in the body and in the brain that help us to numb out pain when we're in this stage. This is also when we get a lot of endorphins released that are called dynorphins that bind to the kappa opioid receptor. And those are involved with out of body experiences, right? If we are detached from our body, it's much easier to tolerate pain.
So we see how this response protects the brain and body at the time of the trauma. Now, the problem is, this form of protection can come with a terrible long-term cost.
Unfortunately, these dynorphins that help facilitate those out of body experiences are also associated with really chronic feelings of depression. And I think that's what a lot of individuals face
when they go into this submit, collapse, those passive defensive responses more chronically. Often people have these prolonged feelings of learned helplessness. Whatever I do will not make a difference. And of course, associated with those chronic feelings of helplessness are very chronic feelings of depressions that we really need to be aware of. But it also comes at a great cost in that we can't think, we can't feel. There's a beautiful description about it by the very famous psychiatrist Crystal, who survived the Holocaust, who really describes going into this state of collapse and how it helped him to survive Auschwitz, but how it came at an incredible cost. So what happens is you're essentially dead to the world.
So we've established how adaptive and even protective collapse submit can be while the trauma is going on. But we can also see how maladaptive and harmful it often is once the trauma has passed. What's more, when your patient's habitual survival response pattern is collapse submit, it can sometimes leave them vulnerable to more trauma. Here's why that is.
If you are in that, what I call that dulled, unaware state as you're moving through life, again, you're not taking in cues of danger around you, that certainly can be more trauma can happen more easily. When you can't activate your survival responses when we actually need them, that's a more dangerous situation.
So now let's look at several ways that collapse submit can present. Because knowing exactly what you're looking for can help you avoid missing it or mistaking it for something else. This really matters because
I think dorsal collapse shutdown happens far more than we recognize. It may seem like a client is just going along. We used to use the word compliance or compliant clients. I often wonder, were they really compliant going along, or were they simply in the dorsal? I'm not really here, so it doesn't matter. So we want to be on the lookout for these moments of dorsal disappearance and then help a client tune into them.
I want to take a quick moment just to emphasize Deb's point that collapse shutdown can often look a lot like compliance or obedience. Because here's the reason behind that.
Her energy starts to flag when that dorsal vagal response comes up. And submissive behaviors or automatic behavior with the Holocaust survivors, there was this robotic movement where you just robotically obeyed the perpetrators because nothing else was a viable option. And children will do that too in severe abusive environments. There'll just be this automatic, almost mechanical obedience. One client really stands out to me who had that. She had been raped by her uncle repeatedly as a child, and she said she was in her 30s at the time, and her uncle would still come to her apartment. And she said he would knock at the door, she would open the door, and she said, "Cynthia took me, and I did whatever you asked." And that's that obedience, just automatic state where she goes into obeying. And there's again survival functions of that because anything else would have made it worse.
So that's one way collapse submit might present, in the form of complying or obeying. Now, in addition, when your patient shows symptoms of depression or signs of helplessness, that may also be a clue that their nervous system is resorting to collapse submit in response to trauma.
So they've learned that the stressor is inescapable, which has gotten them into this state of learned helplessness, which is often associated with really chronic symptoms of depression. And often these individuals would be diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression, which I think we really have to be careful of, because if we recognize it as a state of learned helplessness and submit and collapse, then we can help this individual get out of this state.
I just want to underscore what Dr. Ruthlani has cautioned here, because being able to distinguish between collapse submit and treatment-resistant depression could be critical. To differentiate the two, remember what you're hearing in this session. Collapse submit is a nervous system response to trauma that can get triggered in present time. So if your patient has a trauma history, and especially if they've experienced a childhood trauma that required this adaptation, what might look like depression could actually be collapse submit. We'll get into specific strategies for treatment. There are a few more ways that collapse submit can present that I want you to be sure to know about. This next one has to do with how collapse submit can show up in your patient's relationships.
When they are in this collapse submit state chronically, there are tremendous difficulties in interpersonal relationships. For example, I can think of a number of case examples where my clients had tremendous difficulties, especially dealing with their teenage kids, and that their teenage kids really got out of control, and that the state of collapse and submit really prevented them from engaging with the teenager, setting appropriate boundaries, and because, of course, it got so out of control, they felt even more collapsed and helpless because they weren't able to deal with the situation. But also, a lot of patients present with difficulties at work when they're in this chronic collapse and submit state because, again, they can't stand up for themselves and very often they get taken advantage of. It's really important to be aware of these different presentations, and we also need to think about activities of daily living, right? When somebody is in a severely collapsed and submit state, it's difficult to engage in anything, right? Personal hygiene, cleaning your house, clearing snow, mowing your lawn, and engaging socially. It can also lead to a huge amount of social isolation.
So to recap, we've looked at 4 different ways that collapse submit can present. First, it can masquerade as compliance or obedience. Second, it can sometimes mimic treatment-resistant depression. Third, it can show up in the form of persistent relationship problems. And fourth, it can reveal itself in your patient's aversion to engaging socially or their desire to isolate. So now that we've taken you through some of the most common ways that collapse submit can show up, let's get into how to work with the nervous system to address it. To begin, you need strategies designed to engage the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic is overloaded.
And so the whole point of treatment is to activate the individual, engage the sympathetic nervous system, move from helplessness, passive defensive responses, to engaging active defensive responses, which help you to stand up for yourself, which help you to be present in this world, and that help you to really engage in healthy relationships.
But here's the thing. When you're looking to help your patients stop going into collapse submit as their survival or defense response, you also don't want them going into fight or flight either.
So for these clients, again, they sometimes move into a heightened sympathetic state next, which is sort of the pendulum swinging too far in the other direction. Not where we want to go either, but sometimes that is the next place.
So according to Dana, it can be useful to hone in on the subtle differences among 3 specific states. There's the dorsal vagal state, which is the collapse state. Then there's the sympathetic state. That's the state that's charged with energy. And finally, there's the ventral vagal state, which you might think of as the state of health, balance, and the ability to socially engage with others in meaningful ways. That's the state that you're wanting to help your patient reach. Now, with these 3 states in mind, here's what Deb does next.
So one of the things I do with clients as we're beginning to play around with this is really to help them understand how does your nervous system say no to each of these states, because a sympathetic no is charged with energy. a dorsal vagal no is that collapse, I don't care place. And a ventral no, which many clients haven't yet discovered, is a no that says no, and it's okay for me to say no in this situation. I'm setting a healthy boundary.
So, how might you actually execute this strategy with your patient? Here's how Deb adopts this in her work.
If my client's more common habitual response is going to be go to sympathetic, then I'm going to ask them to say no from that place. And I'm going to give them, oh, here's how my nervous system just responded. And then I'm going to say, so let me say no to you from my sympathetic and see how you respond. So we play that way. Then we're going to go to dorsal. Show me how dorsal would say no. And I'm going to receive it and get a response. And then I'm going to show you mine. And then we're going to come to ventral. And I say, so ventral might be a bit weird for you. So let me play around and let me show you some of the ways that my ventral system can say no. And I'll have them ask me a question. And I say, no, I don't think that feels like what I want to do right now. And have them notice what happens. Ask me another question. No, that won't work for me right now. Ask me another question. Answer it in another way until they begin to get a flavor of it. I also, if it's difficult, may ask them to ask me a question, and I may answer it in my 3 different states and get them to really feel the difference in the moment. Then we're also going to get to understand how to say yes from a ventral place, right? Which I think is equally as important. Because if we've been in a survival response and haven't learned to say no from ventral, it may be that we don't really know how to say yes from ventral.
By the way, we've put together a bonus to give you a polyvagal overview of each of these 3 defenses. So if you've purchased the gold package, you'll be getting this bonus along with several others that are included with the program. Now, let's back up a minute, because like Deb said at the beginning of this session, a patient's experience of collapse shutdown can be unnerving for practitioners. So if that happens for you, what can you do to stay regulated? And not only that, how can you stay grounded and clinically effective when you notice that your own nervous system is responding to the patient's state of collapse?
Stay anchored in your ventral. Don't panic. For people for whom this is not your familiar place, have a colleague take on the characteristics of a dorsal vagal collapse and play around with how do I stay anchored in my system and how do I bring some energy to my colleague who is playing this role for me. And you'll find it's an interesting role play to do with a trusted colleague, because many people find that their sympathetic system lights up really fast. Let me get them out of there. And your colleague can give you feedback about what that feels like to their nervous system. So, in fact, this is an invaluable exercise to do, whether you're familiar with dorsal or not. Understanding how to join with a system in dorsal is really best done when you're getting some feedback from the person who's taking on that role and able to be present enough to help you understand that and give you guidance.
Now that you've heard a few strategies for working with collapse submitted at the level of the nervous system, let's look at how to address it using a somatic approach.
The primary idea for me is to find a physical impulse, because our instincts they're not cognitive, they're subcortical. So to develop flexibility in them, we can't do that just by thinking about it. But when we can find impulses in the body, we can start to reinstate another response. And sometimes, though, you have to prime the pump. I'm thinking of one client, I'll call her Betty. Betty came to me because she had just moved in with her boyfriend, and she was waking up in the night like gagging and choking. And she said it also came up where she said she wasn't able to have sex with her boyfriend. She had an inkling of being orally abused when she was an infant, but no real memory. But she had that collapse in her body and just giving up. And she at one point she just said, "I am so sick of this." She said, "I'm just so sick of this," and her whole body just collapsed. Um, so I wanted to work with aligning her body, because if you think of an active defense like pushing away or running away, let's take pushing away because that's easy, and your body is collapsed, it's going to be really hard to make this motion. So aligning the body is kind of priming the pump. Fighting back is much easier to make from an aligned spine. So we primed the pump by helping her align the body. We practice boundary motions, making boundaries, pushing against the pillow, and just working in a less triggered way, like taking something that she didn't want. I think we just started with food. Like she didn't like broccoli. So I said, okay, this pillow represents broccoli, and I'm going to move it into your circle, and you push it away. So we just start in these non-threatening ways, and then I always want to bring the symptom into the, the therapy room when I can. So I asked her if she could remember that choking motion at night that happened. If she could go back to it, and feel it, and she did. She was like gagging like this, but her hands just came up just like that at one point. And I said, "Okay, push out, push against this pillow, push out right now, push out." And I had to coach her a little bit because it still wasn't real familiar within that context of that symptom. But she did it, and that helped with the symptom. The symptom started going away as she got this other action in the body. So she went from collapse to alignment to being able to push and keep things out.
By now, we've walked you through the latest thinking on the trauma responses of attach cry for help and collapse submit. We've also shared expert strategies for how to work with each one of them. So now, let's get into the third survival strategy that we looked at in this session, and that's please and appease. Please and appease is an active nervous system response that enables people to navigate environments or relationships that are rife with cues of danger.
If you think a minute about someone living in a dangerous home where there is violence, one of the coping strategies, one of the automatic strategies, maybe this please appease, where I make it look like I'm socially connected and engaged, but my sympathetic system is really there running the show. And the purpose of that, the autonomic purpose, is to make sure that I do not activate that other person's sympathetic fight response. So my system is really attuned to what it needs to do to not activate the other person's fight survival response of its own.
It's critical that we understand what please and appease as a trauma survival strategy is all about. You see, it's about maintaining enough vigilance so as not to activate the perpetrator's nervous system. Again, it's a sympathetic state masquerading as socially engaged. Now think about how this response might serve not just individuals, but also groups of people, especially when we consider marginalized groups within a dominant culture. So I want to go a little more in depth into what this can look like.
W.E.B. Du Bois talked about something called double consciousness. And double consciousness is when Black people have to learn what they think and what they want, and learn what do white people want from me and what do they think. Like, in order to navigate in society, someone's having to be bicultural, right? And so that shifting back and forth, it can be emotional labor. And while a piece of it is, let's say, helpful in, like, let's say, surviving or succeeding in predominantly white spaces, really having to be careful that it does not turn into erasure of I am, the fullness of me is now what do people want me to be? How do people want me to speak? How do white people want me to dress? How do they want me to contribute or not contribute, and then lose sight of myself.
So just like the other two strategies that we've looked at in this session, please and appease can be very protective in the moment. The problem is, the longer someone engages in please and appease, the more damage it can do. That's because this strategy compels people to erase their own needs, wants, and even thoughts for the sole purpose of pleasing another person as a way to stave off abuse or mistreatment.
It is a way in which, how do I get through this? Well, if I can get on this person's good side, then either the harm will be less, or it will last. It will be shorter in duration or less in severity, or maybe it will stop altogether if I can please them. And so we see this in like the traditional ways that we usually consider as child abuse and intimate partner violence, right? Or even with sexual assault, that if I can talk to this person, if I can plead with them, or if I can do what makes them happy, then they won't hurt me. And so it is a way that many people have gotten through it, especially when we think about chronic trauma or complex trauma, long-term trauma, where it's not just I need to get through this hour, but like I have to live in this house. And so if I have to be here, how can it be sustainable? And so there are benefits to that.
So when your patient is caught in a please and appease survival strategy, these same behavior patterns can also spill over into the therapeutic relationship. What's more, these behavior patterns can sometimes threaten to lead therapy astray. So let's take a look at some special precautions for working with please and appease.
When we think about that therapeutically, it's so important that we're nourished and balanced before we show up in that space as a therapist, because I need to be tuned into when I'm working with a client who is now trying to please me, right? And that can feel good to us because those are the clients who tell you, thank you so much, right? That was so helpful. Like, you just changed my life. And if, we could just like eat that up. Like, oh my goodness, like, didn't I do a great job?
So you want to be cautious about how you're taking in any kind of positive feedback from your patient. We also want to be so careful about the way that we choose our words, the way that we language with a patient who pleases and appeases. You see, we especially don't want what we're saying to lead them into self-censoring.
Because they're now saying what they think I want to hear. And two, it can turn into having clients who are caretakers of their therapists, right? Where you are needing their affirmation, their validation, and pulling for it in certain ways. And then we see, the sexual misconduct that can